So 2 weeks ago, there was a Quad meeting, and it was interesting seeing the coverage that came out of it, particularly Joe Biden's commitment to defend Taiwan if invaded. But it is important to remember that there are 3 other Quad members, each with their own unique relationship with China. These other 3 nations are also fascinating because they each have a stake in the Pacific and are geographically much closer to China than America is. As a result, a potential World War III scenario that starts elsewhere from Taiwan is likely to involve one of these nations before America's intervention. And so in this video, we'll walk you through the historic relationship between China and the 3 smaller powers: India, Japan, and then finally my country, Australia. Okay, so China's always had something of a precarious relationship with India. Now, there have been border skirmishes as far back as 1959 when India granted asylum to the Dalai Lama after a Tibetan uprising. What Mao tried to do was he tried to negotiate a ceasefire, but all diplomatic settlements were rejected by India, and then in 1962, the two went to war. The result was a certain Chinese victory as India suffered anywhere between 1,400 to 4,900 deaths, depending on whose sources you take as gospel. Alternatively, China suffered 700 to 1,300 deaths, and China also gained control of Aksai Chin in the deeply contested Kashmir region. And so this brings us to the main cause of friction that has historically existed between the two nations, the Kashmir issue. Now, the Kashmir region is essentially a 3,500 kilometer border between Pakistan, India, and China that is yet to be resolved. At the same time, both nations' alliances have always led them away from each other. Much to India's chagrin, China is on good terms with Pakistan, and to China's frustration, India was first aligned with the USSR during the Sino-Soviet split, and then with the USA. It's also worth noting the comparable size of the two nations. Yes, they have similar populations, but in terms of the size of the economies, China is 5 times bigger. China's expansion into the North Indian Ocean has also caused India concern as they have access to port facilities in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. But to get into the more recent history, President Xi and President Modi met in Wuhan in 2018 with an attempt at improving their relationship. From Modi's point of view, he wanted to attract Chinese investment into their economy and at the same time wanted to hedge his bets geopolitically. In 2018, Trump was in the middle of his trade war with Xi, and there were concerns that India would be left behind by an increasingly isolationist America. For Xi, the Indian market was rapidly growing, and he viewed it as a race between China and the USA as to who could get hold of that market first. However, these seemingly improved relations deteriorated in 2020. In June, there was a standoff between Chinese and Indian soldiers at Pangong Lake in West Tibet. The standoff descended into a hand-to-hand melee in which 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers were killed. This caused mass public outrage in India as demonstrators burned Chinese goods, Xi's portrait, the PRC's flag, and they called for a boycott of all Chinese goods. By September, India had blocked heaps of imports, including 250 software apps, with both WeChat and TikTok making that list. Like many other nations, India was furious at China for the outbreak of COVID, particularly as they were so badly devastated by it. For the first time in their history, India deployed a warship in the South China Sea, and they embraced the Quad, a distinctly anti-China alliance. Ever the calculated operator, Xi sought to make amends as quick as possible. When a Chinese soldier was captured by Indian troops, Chinese media outlets kept silent and even promulgated an improbable story that he wandered over the border himself. Xi quietly negotiated his release and offered COVID assistance, though this was rejected. And if you're finding this video helpful, don't you reject the chance to never miss another video on the state of China. Like and subscribe. And so much to Xi's dismay, the damage had been done with the Pangong Lake debacle, and Modi moved 50,000 troops away from the border with Pakistan and to the border with China. In response, Xi's PLA moved long-range artillery to the border. When a commander of the PLA, Chief Fabyal, was announced as the torchbearer for the 2022 Olympics, India decided to boycott the ceremony and it did not air on national TV. The border skirmishes still continue to this day. With Japan, history plays a far more important role than any other Quad nation. When Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and then expanded across the Middle Kingdom in 1937, they brutalized China. There's countless examples to draw upon, but the Nanjing massacre would have to be the worst, where 200,000 civilians were murdered in brutal fashion. 2 Japanese officers even had a contest as to who could be the first to kill 100 Chinese. And so from China's point of view, there's been a lack of contrition and atonement from some of the key Japanese war criminals. This has led to periodic explosions of outrage, including Chinese attacks on Japanese businesses and even on Chinese people driving Japanese cars. Now, in 2012, Japan nationalized the Senkaku Islands by buying them off of a private owner. Japan had regarded these islands as rightfully theirs, and since 1954, America has supported this, but China has adamantly contested this, claiming that the Senkaku Islands are rightfully theirs. With this, the relationship between the two deteriorated and both sent naval, air and paramilitary assets to stake their claim. China then tried to introduce an air defense identification zone around the islands in the East China Sea, demanding that all foreign aircraft notify China before flying through. In protest, America and Japan immediately flew through without notifying China. In 2013, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe also infuriated China by publicly visiting the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which memorializes 14 A-class war criminals. Japan has also rejected any participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, like India, Japan was paranoid about being left behind in Trump's wave of isolationism, and so in 2017, Abe sought to pivot back towards China. In September, he made an appearance at the Chinese embassy on China's National Day, and then he met with Xi Jinping in Vietnam. In 2018, the two had bilateral talks for the first time in 8 years, and relations were looking much more positive. In fact, Xi Jinping was scheduled to visit Tokyo in 2020, but this was cancelled due to the outbreak of COVID and the fact that China received much international condemnation over its handling of the Hong Kong protests in 2019. Throughout 2020, Japan's messaging on defense also became much more hardline. They increased defense spending, breaking its long-standing cap of 1%, and Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi declared that Japan had to protect Taiwan as a democratic country and that Okinawa could be next. Okay, so when it comes to Australia, we actually had an interesting situation recently where our new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, won the election 2 days before jetting off to Tokyo for the Quad meeting. Now, for all my fellow Aussies watching, let me know below who you voted for. ScoMo, Albo, or if you voted for a third party, which one? Now, as you're about to see, when it comes to foreign policy, Australia has always typically mimicked America's actions with major powers. So when Nixon made his visit to see Mao Zedong in 1972, Australia immediately followed and normalised relations with the Middle Kingdom in the same year. Interestingly, though the ball started with Nixon, Australia actually beat America to normalising relations, as they wouldn't normalise relations until Carter was the president a few years later. Now, in the 2000s, Australia went through a mining boom and exported huge amounts of gas and iron ore to China. From 2005 to 2014, China and Australia worked on a free trade deal which came into effect in 2015. The negotiations were largely concluded in November of 2014 when President Xi was visiting Australia, and he actually received a heroic welcome in Parliament. Our then Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, even jumped the gun by saying that Xi was on board with China being fully democratic by 2050.
I have never heard a Chinese leader declare that his country would be fully democratic by 2050. I have never heard a Chinese leader commit so explicitly to a rule-based international order.
This relationship started to deteriorate in 2017 when the next Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, had his government introduce new foreign interference transparency laws. These were widely understood to be targeted at China due to an opposition senator, Sam Dastyari, receiving money from a Chinese company in return for allegedly trying to change his Labour Party's stances on China and Hong Kong. China's beef with Australia wasn't in the tightening of lobby laws. Xi's made ardent moves against corruption. It was that the bill specifically targeted China. Relations continued to deteriorate as the next Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, postured even harder on China as he continued to attend Quad meetings, and then ultimately referred China to the WTO for an inquest into the outbreak of COVID. As the Sino-US relationship continued to deteriorate, Morrison nailed his colours to the US mask. And so then China's response was swift and strong, putting import restrictions on Australian meat, cotton, wool, barley, wheat, timber, copper, lobster and wine. The Global Times, a Chinese newspaper, said if Canberra were intent on infuriating China, there would be dire consequences. China's strategy was to specifically target Australian exports that were dependent upon China, but not those that Chinese industries were dependent upon, namely iron ore and gas. They were also hoping to send a message to the other more powerful Quad members that alignment with the US will come at a cost. The Global Times also said that being a mouthpiece for US aggression against China will cost. Relations only continued to get worse from that point. The largely unpopular Morrison tried to picture himself as a martyr who stood up to China on the globe's behalf and even considered banning TikTok. In 2021, Australia signed the AUKUS defence deal with America and the UK, which was an agreement to share nuclear technology and to purchase nuclear submarines from America. You might remember this greatly annoying the French, who we had previously arranged to buy from and whom we forgot to tell that we were ditching.
You think he lied to you? I don't think. I know.
By this point, China had written off Australia as an unthinking American proxy. And then in 2022, Australia had its biggest blunder when it came to China. The Solomon Islands are right off the doorstep of Australia's north coast and one of the countries most at risk of being drowned by rising sea levels. Australia's foreign aid to the Solomons has diminished in recent years, and Australian politicians were actually caught laughing at the impacts of climate change on Pacific nations. After the 2019 Pacific Island Forum, Australia tried to water down the wording on the severity of climate change, to which China accused Australia of acting as condescending overlords to the Pacific. As part of the Belt and Road, China has offered large infrastructure spending to the Solomons and has vowed to take strong action on climate change. In 2022, the Solomons agreed to China sending military personnel and police to help maintain order, with potential for a military base too. Need I show you right on the map just how detrimental this is to Australia's defence? America had outsourced the Pacific to Australia to manage, and with this failure on Australia's part to secure the Solomons, America was furious. In May, Morrison handedly lost the election to Labour's Anthony Albanese. Albo campaigned on a fairly middle-of-the-road approach to China, but when a Chinese newspaper reported that it would be better for Albanese to win, Morrison called him a Manchurian candidate.
The Prime Minister...
We got another Manchurian candidate!
Only time will tell how the future of the Sino-Australian relationship actually looks. And that's about all I have time for. Thanks for watching, but your job's not done yet. If you want to truly understand the landscape of China, you have to watch this video on how Xi Jinping has consolidated power. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.